Guys, we have another great guest for Fault Lines. We are joined by Max Blumenthal, an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, documentarian, and founder and editor-in-chief of The Gray Zone. Max, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be on.
Absolutely. So, we were supposed to be having a conversation, or in part, on cancel culture. So let's hit that first. A letter was written in Harper's by a large number of people, but was also signed by Chomsky, one of the people who signed the letter. The interesting part about this, though, is when you had an opportunity to have a conversation, I think it was Katie Halper, having a conversation with Chatter Williamson, one of the people who signed the letter and one of the people who helped put it together. They held off Glenn Greenwald on the letter because they had feelings about Glenn Greenwald being on a letter about cancel culture. So, in and of itself, there's this weird quirk about this stuff. Barry Weiss left, I believe it was the New York Times, and decried the cancel culture in doing so. What do you think about the cancel culture letter and even the response to the cancel culture letter? I agree with it that there's a problem when you get to the point of trying to alienate various people within your population. I disagree that Barry Weiss is an example of that, considering she was the person that went on and attacked Tulsi Gabbard on Joe Rogan and didn't even know what the attacks were
Yeah.
about. So, how do you see the cancel culture argument that's unfolding and that's been taking place?
Well, the funny part was that they canceled Glenn Greenwald before he could even be on the letter
Right.
being edited. So
Right,
it
right.
just shows what a bunch of frauds they are. I mean, and I've been canceled so many times that people can't stop talking about me. So I wasn't invited to be on the letter. If I had, I would have told them to go to hell because the people who are on that letter, who organized that letter, are people who've spent their lives and their careers and their adult lives canceling people for having opinions that were either too controversial or were too what they would call anti-Israel. So many of the people around that letter, involved in that letter, are neocons who have dedicated themselves to freezing out Palestinian academics and journalists from the discussion about Israel Palestine, Barry Weiss being one of them. Barry Weiss's whole career was incubated basically in a neoconservative hothouse with pro Israel millionaires and billionaires creating all these fellowships for her. She wreaked havoc on the campus of Columbia University to destroy the career she failed of Joseph Massad, a professor of literature and Middle East studies, who's really one of I think, the leading uh, minds in the academy, period. Someone whose work is very adventurous, controversial, whose columns at Middle East Eye are always on point and really uh, so provocative, but also so illuminating about issues ranging from the Middle East to the current rebellion against structural racism. And she is someone who has produced no work of value that I can see. Certainly nothing peer reviewed. She didn't have to jump through the academic hoops Joseph Massad did. And what she did was she worked with powerful pro-Israel groups and pro-Israel students to demonize him as an anti-Semite and try to drive him off campus. In the process, she got the dean of one school at Columbia, probably got her fired, attempted to get the dean of Columbia University as a whole fired, and now she's concerned about cancel culture. And she's brought onto this letter people who, I mean, I laid it out at the Gray Zone, a who's who of people who have used powerful positions to not only cancel employees of theirs, like Anne Marie Slaughter canceled Zephyr Teachout, who ironically signed this letter because her donors at Google at the New America Foundation were mad that Zephyr was, talking too much about inequality. Anne Marie Slaughter also was in the Hillary Clinton State Department when they canceled the life of Muammar Gaddafi. You have Gloria Steinem signing that letter. In the 1960s, Gloria Steinem, through the Congress of Cultural Freedom, a CIA front group, took it upon herself to cancel socialists, communists, black radicals, radical feminists within the left. That was the work that she admitted she did in working hand in glove with the CIA. And I could just go down the line of people on that letter and their hypocrisy. But there's a larger issue there, which is like, why are we focusing so much on the right to unlimited political speech, and why are all these letters going around? And you don't see public intellectuals and major, self-styled thought leaders running around with writing letters calling for the right to free water, or the right to free housing, or the right to free university education. Those rights to them don't really matter. And these are the rights that we do not have in the United States, that people are in the streets across the country getting shot with rubber bullets and tear gassed for. And there are no letters in Harper's about that. And the counter letter to the Harper's letter didn't address that. It was like, it's just this completely delusional discussion that isn't relevant to most of the people in the world.
Let's go to that for the moment. I agree with you on that, right? That basically a letter came out with cancel culture, the two fighting over something that may not necessarily be the highest priority given what's going on. How do you, in your mind, with all of the protests and everything else that are going on, and with the Trump response to it, how do you process that? Like, how do you view that when you're thinking of that and thinking of the reasons that the people are out there protesting? And for that matter, the response. I mean, Trump's response seems unhinged to me. How do you process it?
I mean, the letter came about because of the hysteria about identity politics, and there is something truly annoying about a lot of the people who are pushing all of these neologisms and new phrases and enforcing a new kind of language on everyone in media. And it annoys me, but I'm not like, I just don't, it's not like at the top of my priority list of things that I find protest worthy. Like, I'm more concerned about the U.S. trying to prevent Venezuela from having fuel and food and assets, or doing that to countries across the world, preventing Syria from getting hospital supplies, or the
Well,
fact that,
wait. When I mean protest worthy, I don't mean the letter per se. I mean,
yeah,
like, I guess I'm making a hard pivot. All of those
no,
people who are out on the streets after George Floyd was killed and murdered, and you have the protests that are in Portland right now. You have the protests, I think they were in Colorado, um, and these things spread all across the world, and even in places that didn't really have blacks,
yeah,
like even in Europe. I guess
yeah.
what I'm asking is, how do you process that when you're looking at that and you're looking at the people agitated across the United States, and how do you and reconcile that with the response that Trump took, either in Portland or, for that matter, in these other states like Chicago, or Chicago's a city, but these other cities where he's sending federal troops to?
I mean, the way I see it is, I always saw it as inevitable that the end of the Trump era, which it looks like we're looking at right now, was going to take this kind of form of just mass civil unrest and brutal repression, with Trump kind of trying to exploit the repression and the protests to drive some kind of law and order campaign. I didn't think it would be so severe because I couldn't have predicted a pandemic, and Trump blaming China for the pandemic. But I always knew his campaign was going to be focused heavily on this nebulous Antifa force and trying to mobilize older voters by scaring them about a breakdown in law and order. And I always knew that people across the country, from the progressive center left to the radical left, were spoiling for a street fight with Trump. And then you pen people up in their homes and lock them down, deny them a physical community, tell them to spend the next 2 years on Zoom, and then they start seeing images of a cop just for 8 minutes in an excruciating fashion strangling a black man to death. Evictions are starting to take place. The economy is completely collapsing. You have one of the most unprecedented graduations of wealth to the top 0.01% in history. People are going to get out in the streets, and it is definitely about structural racism. It's about the police, but it's so much bigger than that. And there's so many reasons people have to be out there. What Trump has done is he's lost control of the economy. That's what he was going to run on. I thought that there hadn't been a pandemic, which Trump helped, you know, he didn't exactly spend January and February preparing the country to defend itself against an epidemic of coronavirus. So, the bottom's fallen out from the economy. I thought that if the economy had been strong, Trump would have run neck and neck with Biden, would have possibly won. It wouldn't have been that difficult for him to make mincemeat of someone who doesn't exactly know where he is in a debate. But now here we are, and I think so many people are ready to vote for a
Biden.
dirty diaper. They don't even care if it's Biden. They'll vote for a diaper
Yeah.
over Trump. Just anything that isn't Trump. And what Trump's last ditch Hail Mary play is to get federal troops in the street, supersede and overwhelm Democratic authorities, claim that the Democratic mayors have lost control of their cities, and that only Donald Trump can come in and restore law and order. And, there's a complete intelligence failure there, I think, on the part of Trump and Ken Cuccinelli and these clowns in the Department of Homeland Security who don't seem to have ever left Cuccinelli, this guy's like a far right character from the suburbs of Virginia who's never left his gated community. The intelligence failures, they don't know what Portland is. They don't realize that, like, Portland is, like, there's just so many guys in Portland who are willing to carry this kind of street fight with the feds out for the whole summer. They're not going to go away. The city, it's one of the most progressive or left-wing cities. It's filled with anarchists. I mean, there are so many anarchists in Portland who will just know how to do this. And it's just not going to be, they're not going to be able to suppress these protests. And then you get these walls of moms who are just and veterans,
Wall of dads,
wall of
wall of
dads.
veterans. Yeah,
Yeah. You just get, and each one gets more sympathetic than the last.
it's like wall of babies,
Wall
wall
of
of people with bad legs. Yeah,
yeah, wall of disabled veterans, wall of seniors, and
it's like the cop beat
that's
this
it.
guy up with multiple sclerosis. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's so horrible.
exactly. So it's not working out well for Trump. Our friend Wyatt Reed just got back to D.C. from there, and he told me that
Yeah, he got shot.
he got shot in the hand. They shot him while he was holding his cell phone, trying to take some footage. They shot him in the hand, and he sprained his finger, and I think they cut him pretty badly.
Let
And
me
then
ask you
Mike,
this. Well, I was going to get into this notion of, so the way we're putting federal troops in on the ground, those events you would have thought was coming out of some other country that the United States had invaded. Like, it looks bad. And the tactics that the people in Portland are using seem to be evolving, meaning, look, boards and leaf blowers that blow out the smoke and that type of stuff. In the old days, we used to invade countries in a similar way, but we used to use the CIA for those operations. Those operations, though, have been, let's say, put into the hands of NGOs, meaning NGOs carrying out operations and tasks that the CIA used to do in the various other countries. How has that evolved? Is that still going on? And is that something that is even being used on home soil in order to undermine these protests?
well, what's being used to undermine the protests is every agency, every so-called law enforcement agency that's been reorganized under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security, this gigantic leviathan that sprung up after 9/11 with total bipartisan support as the base, the key hub of this massive security state, the post 9/11 security state. And so you've got Border Patrol, ICE, the deportation machine, which really went into action at the end of the George W. Bush administration, and Barack Obama became the deportation king, and now Trump has really proudly embraced ICE as his personal Praetorian guard against the immigrant community that he calls bad hombres. Then you've got, BORTAC, which is part of the Border Patrol, but they're the tactical SWAT team, and they have the authority to operate anywhere in the country as basically an urban paramilitary force. They're attached to the border patrol, but they're not patrolling the border. Then you've got um, U.S. Marshals who are supposed to kind of like they're supposed to go arrest federal criminals, and they have no training in riot patrol, but they have the authority to go into cities and act as the president's own personal police force or secret police. And what the president has done is something that I thought was always inevitable after 9/11, which was to define a domestic group that had no connection to foreign terrorist operations as a terrorist group simply because it was politically convenient to do so. We saw George W. Bush go after Muslim American civil society, claiming they're connected to terror. And we saw the deportation machine. Well, this is just the inevitable result of the post 9/11 national security state, or what we could call now a police state. And it's not being, the connection hasn't been made, I don't think, strongly enough. I think people are exceptionalizing what's happening in Portland, and they're seeing it as Trump's secret police, when the fact is, when Trump leaves, that secret police force and its unchecked authority is still going to be there.
Wow. When you look at the world and you look out at the things, for example, Hong Kong, and you see all of these groups that are basically U.S. policy towards Hong Kong is basically a way of trying to get towards China. What do you think happens there over time? Meaning, do you think Hong Kong is China's, but the United States is trying to basically make them pay for asserting any kind of authority over their own country? Was the U.S. working in China in order to get that effect? I mean, I think the answer is obvious, but it seems like there were multiple intelligence services that were working in China with the United States in order to get that effect, either to get China to um, over compensate, meaning to put in force, like military force, in order to
Yeah, yeah.
get the situation, or for that matter, to leave it in just utter chaos. Am I wrong in this? Am I appraisal of what was taking place there in regards to U.S. strategy?
Well, just imagine if you have Chinese media in Washington like CGTN or Xinhua. Just imagine if they were exposed for helping direct protests in Portland or Washington,
Right.
D.C., and that they had been coordinating and providing logistics and communications gear to protesters. It would have been just like a gigantic national scandal that would have brought U.S. and China relations to the brink, where they pretty much already are. But this past month, we learned that the global agency, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is the parent company, the U.S. government parent company of Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, which broadcasts across Asia, had spent $2 million on the protests in Hong Kong, providing protesters who are not peaceful protesters. I mean, they're
It was like
there's
knives and box cutters hitting people in the heads that
box
was
cutters.
against their, yeah.
Yeah, people if people would argue with them, they would be physically assaulted. A guy was burned alive. I mean, he lived for arguing with them. I mean, just attacks on police departments, stuff that is condemned by the Trump administration but supported in Hong Kong. Uh, they were giving communications gear and secure encrypted equipment to the protesters, $2 million worth. And this is the U.S. media in China's, not China's backyard, inside China. I mean, that to me is remarkable. And didn't even register in U.S. media. It's just treated as this normal thing when we spent the past 4 years talking about Russian meddling. That to
Right,
me is the
right.
ultimate kind of meddling. And then there's the fact that the National Endowment for Democracy, a U.S. group, U.S. government group that was spun out of the CIA in the 1980s, has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to incubate various unions and protest groups in Hong Kong. And what they've done is created what they hoped to do was create a kind of Tiananmen Square moment where they could show massive Chinese repression with people being shot and killed, and then China would be sanctioned, and the world would wag its finger at China, and the U.S. would appear as the moral authority on the shining hilltop. But Hong Kong's police didn't kill anyone. No one was killed in all of these protests. Still, the US went ahead with sanctions. And still, the US is turning up the heat on China, carrying out war games in the South China Sea, declaring that China has no right to the navigation, freedom of navigation lines that it's drawn in the South China Sea. Two Australian top ministers met with Mike 2 days ago in Washington to echo the US's call for more naval aggression in the South China Sea. So, I mean, they didn't get their Tiananmen Square moment, but they managed to at least stir up protests, which are absolutely separatist in nature. You have protest leaders, former protest leaders like Joshua Wong or Nathan Law, posing for photos with the former British colonial governor, Chris Patten, and meeting with Mike Pompeo. It's like it couldn't be more obvious what the agenda was. And here we are in the middle of a new Cold War, which I think will be terrible for everyone, especially here in the US.
No, absolutely. And that gets to something that's really interesting. You've been in media for a while. I've been following your work for years at this point. And I don't necessarily know if you've worked in mainstream media circles in regards to the way they operate. But why do they toe this line? Meaning, how do they get the narrative that they go along with? Because, I mean, basically, you've looked at this and you've said the most rational thing in the world. These guys are carrying American flags. These guys have certain points of contact that we're interacting with in Hong Kong that we know of. I forget the millionaire or the rich guy that's there who's been working with Pompeo. But
Yeah, Jimmy Lai.
Lai, right, Jimmy Lai. And so you've had all of these links that are obvious and clear as day, and mainstream media doesn't cover it. I mean, the same thing about Syria, right? You have the information coming out showing that the people who were involved in the weapons inspections were basically maneuvered in order to try to come down with a very specific outcome that many of the inspectors said wasn't necessarily true. Now,
Yeah.
media doesn't carry that part. Media will carry, oh, there's been a weapons strike, but they wouldn't make the point that, well, wait a minute, Turkey had access to those weapons. The terrorists there have an incentive to do so. I guess what I'm getting at is how does that narrative get generated? Meaning, when you come and you look at this and say, well, wait a minute, it's the obvious thing in the world that if this was America, people's head would explode, but they aren't exploding over there. How does that narrative get created and what happens? How do they get people to basically fall in line with whatever narrative that is that's created from the standpoint of media?
I wonder how many people fall in line. Basically, the media falls in line, and
Yeah.
what we're not dealing with a media per se. What we're dealing with is essentially a wing of the national security state that is waging an information war. The U.S. is, finding it much harder to wage a conventional war since it failed in Iraq, since Afghanistan has been dragging on for 20 years. And so it's turning to hybrid warfare, which is, comprised of really three modalities. Non-conventional warfare, like we saw in Syria, where irregular forces who turned out to be al-Qaeda aligned militias are armed through semi-covert channels by the CIA or working with like the Gulf states and Turkish intelligence. It's like the Contras in Central America. Then there's economic warfare, where the U.S. is sanctioning countries around the world, trying to strangle them. You have State Department officials like Elliot Abrams or Brian Hook bragging about tanking the Venezuelan economy, crashing the Iranian economy. It's basically financial terrorism. And there's no domestic cost. Like, American voters don't care about this. And then the third modality or tactic is information warfare. Information warfare could take the form of using false propaganda to create divisions internally or reporting on corruption scandals and things like that internally, which is like what Voice of America does through Radio Free Asia. They broadcast in the native language of these countries. But the U.S. public is the ultimate target of this information war in the new Cold War. And we're bombarded with propaganda, specifically humanitarian propaganda, that aims to make the sector of the public that is typically most resistant to war and permanent war campaigns, like we're seeing, supportive. Humanitarian campaigns would take the form of like the Syrian White Helmets, which we've exposed not only as a jihadist aligned ancillary to the extremist militias that the CIA and Turkey were arming, but also as something that wasn't created in Turkey. It was created by a military intelligence officer named James Le Mercier, who committed suicide last year, apparently, and has now been revealed in Dutch media as a gigantic fraud who is stealing millions of dollars from the donor governments to the White Helmets. And as you mentioned, Jamal, these stories do not get conveyed back to the U.S. public. This is a titanic scandal, and we've seen no reporting about it in U.S. media that not only reported on the White Helmets, celebrated them, honored them with an Oscar for their Netflix documentary, nominated them for a Nobel Peace Prize. And so propaganda can also take the form of omission or silence, not reporting the truth. But basically, it's all targeted at the progressive, middle-class, coastal population that comprises the base of the Democratic Party to get them to line up to support regime change in whatever country a very right-wing administration in Washington wants to target. And we'll see Biden pursue that same agenda. So those of us in the media who don't like war, don't like this global hostility, would like to see peace between nations, or a multipolar, multilateral world order where institutions like the United Nations are legitimized and strengthened, and the principle of non-interference enshrined in the Geneva Conventions is honored. We wind up getting put on the other side of this information war, where we're trying to convey the stories that aren't being told back to the U.S. public, and we become targeted as well, and smeared, censored. And so that's sort of the position we find ourselves in right now. But I think it's a real duty that we have to uphold, because we can't just
There's
we
nothing
can't
else.
just there's nothing else to do. But we if we don't do it seriously, nobody else will.
Yeah, we're the conscience of this nation in real terms. Let me ask you this. One of the arguments that is typically made is often made in the framing of, look, this country is not a threat to us. So if we're talking about, say, for like Venezuela, and Obama say, oh, Venezuela is a national security threat. Nobody raises their hands and says how. They just kind of go along with it. Yeah, okay, Obama said it. Trump ups the ante. Same thing with Iran. Nobody really makes this argument that a lot of the bad blood with Iran started when we created a coup in that country. That gets yada yada to the side, and the only thing that's talked about is like the last 3 minutes of history. Um, the argument that I think that they're inherently, implicitly making, they would never say it, is that basically, look, this world has no rules. And as it has no rules, we have to dominate, because if we don't dominate, we will be dominated, and there's nothing that could come out of the ether for the cosmic beings of sorts that will prevent us or prevent that reality from happening. Meaning, if we don't rule, one of the other countries will, and we may not necessarily like what takes place under those countries. Now, is there a legitimacy to that argument, or is that argument a self-serving argument that's just there entirely for the point of being able to take this kind of foreign policy of brinksmanship across the world?
That's a great question, and it really is a self-serving perspective that is a projection of the imperialist American outlook, and really an outlook that derives from the white supremacist settler colonial origins of this country. It was projected onto the Soviet Union by George Kennan, who was Truman's national security advisor when he basically conceived the new Cold War through the National Security Order number 68, which held that the Soviet Union had the intention to conquer the world and was hostile and intent on making war with the United States, when the Soviet Union in reality was bunkered, had been consistently under siege, and only sought the ability to have a sphere of influence. And so that perspective was used to deny the Soviet Union a right to a sphere of influence and to attack it on its frontiers, culminating in the dirty war in Afghanistan that the CIA waged against a pro-Soviet government. And now we see that perspective applied to China, a country which has maybe carried out some military campaigns, or you could use a most severe term, conquests on its frontiers, but which has no global ambitions like the United States. It's not going thousands of miles around the world to invade countries like Iraq or to occupy places in Syria. It's working with other countries through peaceable means like the Belt and Road Initiative. But what we're told here constantly is that if the US retreats from its global empire, this vast archipelago of bases, which is really centered in East Asia, around the Pacific Rim, that China will not only dominate that region, it will dominate the entire world, and we will be under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. That's the rhetoric that Mike Pompeo is using day after day in virtually every speech. And tragically, I hear it echoed in warmed over sort of human rights terms by some figures and outlets on what passes for the left in the United States.
Uyghurs. They would say, "Hey, the Uyghurs, the Uyghurs, the Uyghurs,"
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and yeah, and a lot of times it misses the point that the U.S. has 25% of the world's population in our jails. Like, I don't think we entirely reconcile sometimes what we say with the hypocrisy associated with the words themselves. Um, I don't entirely know what's going on with the Uyghurs. I do know it's none of my business. And do you think so? This is a new Cold
Does
War.
anyone
You
know
would
what's going
say,
on? Like, does anyone know? Like, okay, like we're told that like 1/10 of the population of an entire province in China is in concentration camps. So like, shouldn't we be getting like better evidence about that than we're currently getting? Like, and could this possibly be another humanitarian propaganda ploy to legitimize a Cold War? Like, are we even allowed to
exactly.
ask those questions? And the fact is, we're not. We're not allowed to ask
Does
those
it,
questions.
even beyond it, does it even matter? Now, I don't mean from the standpoint of human life. Don't misunderstand me. I care about all life. I don't want anybody to be in dire straits. But from the standpoint of us in this country engaging China, is that really the forefront of our responsibilities, considering we have over 145,000 people dead here? Like, I guess I'm saying on order priorities, it seems like this is something that's just put up in order to create a reason for hostility as opposed to a thing unto itself.
I mean, do any of
That's
the
the way it,
people who talk about Uyghurs all the time care about the fact that the population that is proportionately in prison for petty crimes and basically for being poor are Black Americans? That we basically have, racial gulags for the poor across this country, and that the population there is much higher than what we're told in the most propagandistic interpretation of the situation in northwestern China is their quote unquote concentration camp population. Like, these, they never talk about what's happening in our own backyard, which is real and which I've seen up close and personal. It's almost, and it just shows you how disingenuous they are.
last question: when you're looking when you're looking at issues like the Uyghurs, or can you hear me? Hello, hello.
Hello.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
There you are. Yeah. When you're looking at situations like either, for that matter, the Uyghurs or what was taking place in Syria and those type of things, when they bring out the humanitarian reasons for the argument, how do you push back against that? Because what they try to do is basically say, hey, you have this particular problem here, but don't pay attention to any of the context surrounding this issue. Just focus on the very specific issue itself. And if you kind of point out, hey, you also have that issue going on, it might not be the exact same issue, but you have something similar going on in a similar way. It seems like Democrats like humanitarian reasons for bombing. Republicans just go with the bombing. What does this end? And maybe that's the question, and I'll end it on that. We have all sorts of crises that are availing this particular nation. And this country still doesn't necessarily have a mindset towards what goes on around the world. I mean, basically, like you said, we don't necessarily care. They don't have any consequence for either the killing of Soleimani, for example, that went off without a consequence. We don't have a consequence for the stealing of the oil in Syria or the destroying of the crops in Syria. So it's almost like foreign policy is a thing unto itself that doesn't necessarily have a consequence associated with it. But the things that happen in the United States seem to have a consequence. There doesn't seem to be a political solution out of this. It just doesn't. With what you know either of history or what you know of current events or other countries that have dealt with twin crisis at the moment, something like this, what happens from here?
Well, what
That's a large,
happens from
expansive
here?
question, but we're going to get your
Expecting,
prognostication ability from here on out. It's like, all right, what happens? What happens?
I wasn't expecting it to go there, but we are in a really dangerous situation right now with the Trump administration and bipartisan consensus behind it, the heat on China to an unprecedented degree. There's even talk of a total ban on members of the Chinese Communist Party to the United States. That's like close to 100 million people. The Houston embassy, the Houston consulate being just removed without any real clear justification. Just told everything China does is espionage. Where will it lead? We should, before we ask where it leads, we should ask why it's happening, and that'll tell us a lot about where things are going. It's happening because China, for the last really 12 years since the U.S. financial crisis, has been emerging as a major, not just a threat to U.S. global hegemony, which is the essence of American empire, but as the leading power, leading economic power in the world. And a country that has a very different model than the United States, that has a system that's demonstrated its strength through this pandemic by getting it under control while COVID is raging out of control in the United States. And it appears that there's no country here, there's no central authority. It's a country in China that holds the promise of a multilateral, multipolar world order that truly believes through its system in the principle of non-interference, and which is also supportive of traditionally third world countries, including those that have socialist governments. It's been supportive of Venezuela throughout this pandemic, and since the U.S. has attempted to topple its government in a coup in a very principled way. And that is just incredibly threatening to the captains of U.S. empire and the national security state. And so the U.S. is going all out to try to hold off the inevitable being China's development. And I don't think that it's going to be possible unless the U.S. does something crazy, like a war around the South China Sea. I don't see it as possible. So what's going to
Well,
happen
that's a good
next?
question.
Yeah.
Brinksmanship. I mean, because they are ramping up this stuff, like in regards to the rhetoric against China and even the military exercises in the South China Sea. I mean, doesn't that bring us, China has a working association with Russia, and you have almost like two world orders going on: the Belt and Road Initiative, and then you have something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Joe Biden and Obama was working on, and you have Trump's point of view of him just trying to stop countries from working with China in general. So he would say, "Hey, I don't want you guys to use Huawei," and Europe patsies, okay. Or they would say, "Hey, I don't want the gas thing is between China, Russia, and Germany." But even that, he didn't want them to do. Meaning, he's taken politics into the economic sphere in a blunt, overt way that wasn't necessarily there before in order to curtail Chinese expansion or Chinese growth. I mean, just natural growth. It's 1 billion people. Um, to me, that has the potential for brinksmanship error, meaning they push it in a way where it does actually cause some kind of conflict in the South China Sea that escalates to something that is a little bit more than just a basic regional conflict with somebody who is a nuclear power.
I mean, it's very possible the U.S. is been waging war games and freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea for several weeks, and China's been countering. There's been discussion, which would be of placing U.S. the U.S. military in Taiwan, which is a gigantic violation of a Chinese red line, the one nation policy. It's just deliberately crossing a red line. If you understand China's grand strategy, I mean, I think that's the main red line that you have to understand is you just don't cross them on the one nation policy. But I don't know if it's going to go there. We're on the brink of something potentially terrible. But short of that, and even if it does occur, I think given how overextended the U.S. is and what we just witnessed on the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt, where coronavirus broke out on the ship and the ship had to dock.
Yeah.
You know, this ship was supposed to be out there and was kept out there by a partisan Navy secretary who was demanding that these sailors continue to get infected so that they can contain China. You see the weakness of the U.S. empire, and particularly its carrier fleets and all of these naval deployments, whereas China is operating with standoff capacity from its own territory and its own frontiers. They could potentially win a naval engagement against the U.S. And I think that's acknowledged within the national security state. So what we're left with is China's continued development. Its GDP has grown since it got COVID under control at a rate of 3.5%, which isn't where it was projected to be before the pandemic, which is still enviable, whereas the U.S. is in a state of chaos. And we're heading towards a different world order where the U.S. financial hegemony, which is the foundation of American empire along with its military, is being challenged in a way like it hasn't before. And that's why I think internally we're seeing so much chaos and so much rage directed at people who won't get on board with the imperial pushback.
But what does that new world look like? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to add another question to this, but what does that new world look like? Because I think all of the consternation in this is basically that the U.S. has led a world order going to the Second World War. And since that point on, that leadership might have been something that the world, for the most part, was accepting because it wasn't this kind of belligerence and it wasn't using either economic power or whatever power they had at their disposal to override the sovereignty of the various nations that were there. If China takes over, what does that look like from the standpoint of a world order? And how is that different from the U.S.? And I promise this is the last question.
Well, I don't think China is going to take over. I don't think it seeks to take over. It seeks
But
to
you would agree
control.
with me that with a billion people, just they take up space just from their economic growth.
Yeah.
Like just from the very basic and natural growth of a country that size, they're going to be dominant just because of just because of what they are. I guess that's where I'm going with that. That's my thinking on that. Meaning they don't have to take it. It's just going to be there just because of what they are.
Yeah, I just don't think it has the same, among the leadership. I don't think and given China's history, I don't think it seeks the same kind of imperial expansion as the United States, or
I see.
depends on it the same way that European social democracies do, where they don't have the resources. They depend on the U.S. military to get them those resources. But what I really would, for anyone listening to this, there's a really forward-looking book that was published in 2009 called China's Global Strategy. It's by Jenny Clegg, and she really forecasts the kind of world that we're living in or moving towards right now. And it's just simply, as I've said several times, a multilateral or multipolar world order where powerful countries and their allies are able to chart their own path and dictate their sphere of influence, and countries are able to determine their own alliances. And I think that means a more democratic world where a country like Venezuela doesn't have to submit to a medieval siege policy if it wants to have a socialist-oriented government that distributes its natural wealth specifically its oil wealth, to back to the population through social programs. The U.S. is extremely hostile to a government like that because it wants those natural resources. But you've seen the relationship between China and Venezuela, and it's one of kind of mutual respect.
Yeah.
So, and you know, you mentioned the post World War II order. Well, the Soviet Union did serve as a check on
U.S. power.
U.S. power, U.S. imperial ambitions. It was sort of a bipolar world order. And once the Soviet Union was collapsed, rather than reformed as its leadership naively thought they could do, we saw the U.S. rampage with the Gulf War, the destruction of Yugoslavia, the destruction of Iraq, then the humanitarian interventions of the Arab Spring. And still, the U.S. continues going, but it's finally being checked for the first time since the first Cold War. And like, so that really shows you, I think, the value of other centers of power in the world. It actually can save lives. And, you know, having traveled around the world, especially to a lot of these flashpoints where the U.S. seeks regime change, it's what people want. It's what they're yearning for.
Max, I really appreciate you coming on. This is Max Blumenthal, an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, documentarian, and founder and editor of The Gray Zone. Max, thank you again, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Jamal.
Have a good one. All
You
right,
too.
guys. That was the second interview. This one, Max Blumenthal. This is also going to go up on Fault Lines. An amazing 6 people are watching. That's painful. Yeah, it's. I'm gonna check back on Friday to see if they've, to see if it has come back up. But honestly, man, it's dispiriting, right? It's like you do your show, you do your job, you're not doing anything wrong, and all of a sudden you have this higher body that says, "Yeah, we don't like that, so we're gonna cut that off." And just so happens it's about Joe Biden. It just so happens to seem like they're protecting a man that's living in his basement. I don't think that video even had 1,000 views if it has that many. And all of a sudden they took the channel down for it. It also probably didn't help that I was bitching at him, kind of making the point that you guys are taking a channel down in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic with 30 million people out of a job, but a lot of people are using this stuff for their living. That probably didn't go over all that well. Nevertheless, Friday is supposed to come back on. Unfortunately, it's still going to have a warning on it, which makes any infraction of the rule that they come up with that much more severe. But the appeal is in. Like, share, subscribe, and I'm with you, Garden. Fuck those people. Thanks all.